Good morning. So, something I wanted to talk to you about today is grief. Now, I had a conversation with somebody very recently about grief, and their sort of perception on it was that that grief gets smaller over time, so it kind of dissipates over time. The longer you deal with grief, the less heavy it becomes. And this is a common perception of grief, and I think there's a lot of content around grief that kind of portrays it in that way. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm not saying that that's wrong at all. But I just wanted to share my perspective on grief. So, lots and lots of people think that grief is very much felt like this at the top here. So, when grief first happens, if grief is this big circle, when grief first happens or something happens in life and we start to grieve, perhaps we've lost a loved one or something's happened, we experience grief like this, and it's very big, it's very large, it's very impactful on our box, which is us as people and our lives. Now, as we go about our life, this ball, let's just say the ball, if I give it a jiggle, the ball's going to move around, isn't it? And every time it touches the side of this square is every time we re-experience that grief. So, of course, in the first instance, because this grief is so big, we are experiencing the feelings, the emotions and things like that as part of that grief quite regularly, because the grief is so big inside of us. It's hitting the sides and we're having these experiences very, very regular. So over time, of this other person's perspective, or what perspective a lot of people perceive, is that over time grief gets smaller. And then as we go through our lives, because grief has gotten smaller and it's not feeling so big and it's not feeling so impactful on us anymore, it's not hitting the sides as often. It will do over time, on the odd occasion, but it's not doing it as often. So that's some people's perspective on grief. And as I've said, I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I have a different perspective on grief and I just wanted to share it with you. So my perspective on grief is this. So yes, when grief, I'm losing my face now, when grief first happens, it very much is experienced like this, isn't it? Of course, it's very fresh, it's very heavy, it's very emotional, and it's a lot for any person to process. And we will all process grief differently. Yes, it will impact on our lives, and it will impact on our lives very drastically in that first instance, because it's a fresh, raw, new emotion, new feeling, new experience. And so, yeah, it will hit the sides of your box or of you, of your life, very, very regular. Grief in the first instance is a massive, massive emotion and feeling, and it can be very difficult to process and go through. So what do I think happens from this point? So I don't think grief changes at all. I don't think grief changes at all. I think that grief is always with you, and that grief will go through life with you. You're always going to miss that person if it's somebody you've lost. You're always going to grieve for whatever it is you may have lost or whatever happened. Grief will always remain with you, in my opinion. But what happens is we, as individuals, as people, we grow around that grief. We learn to process it, we learn to live with it, we learn to move forward with it. So yes, the same concept happens, as in over time, our grief may not feel so big because we have grown with it, we have grown around it, we are processing it, we are moving forward with it. But for me, I don't think grief ever changes. I don't think the grief ever gets smaller. I think we as people change, and we learn to process and we learn to live with that grief, because we need to. We have to learn from the things that happen, whether they're happy events or positive things, or whether it is grief and it's something that's very difficult for people to process. I think it's us that changes. I don't think grief changes. And I say that from a place of grief. So I would say my grief is still kind of very much raw. It was an event and something that took place in January. So it is probably still very much raw for me. But yeah, I just wanted to share my perspective on that. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think and feel about grief, and give us a shout. Any questions, as always, please touch base with me. Please ask. Any content that you'd like for me to just have a talk about, or questions or anything like that, always just give us a shout. Have a happy Monday. I hope you've had a great weekend, and I'll see you all on Thursday.